Most people think China's behavior today is driven by ideology, ambition, or fear. That's wrong. China's not acting irrationally, it's not improvising, and it's definitely not lashing out. What you're watching in 2026 is a result of a lesson China learned the hard way, when foreign powers burned its cities, flooded its population with drugs, and legally stripped it of sovereignty. This video isn't about recounting the Opium Wars, it's about what China learned from them. Because once you understand that, China's focus on control, technology, borders, and non-interference suddenly stops looking random. You don't have to agree with China, but if you want to predict what it will do next, you'll need to understand what it's trying to prevent. And that story starts long before today. In the 18th century, China was the world's most sophisticated civilization, possessing a centralized government and industries like silk and porcelain that the West could not replicate. When the British Macartney Embassy arrived in 1793 seeking expanded trade, Emperor Qianlong rejected all key British requests. In his letter to King George III, Qianlong wrote, "Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no products within its own border." This clash foreshadowed the century of conflict and unequal treaties that would follow in the 19th century. But the most critical commodity was tea. By this time, tea had become the cultural lifeblood of Britain. The British were importing millions of pounds of it annually. This created a catastrophic trade deficit. Every year, roughly 2 million ounces of silver flowed out of Britain into Chinese coffers. Britain was losing massive amounts of capital, and the economy was under immense strain. They needed a product that China had to buy. The solution was found in poppy fields of British-controlled India. The British East India Company turned opium production into an industrial-scale operation. Because opium was illegal in China, the British used a plausible deniability strategy, selling the drug to smugglers who carried it into the Chinese coast under protection of the British flag. It was history's largest state-backed drug operation. By 1838, opium flooding into China exploded to 40,000 chests per year. The silver flow reversed. The Chinese were now draining their own treasury to fund the national addiction. By the late 1830s, China was collapsing. Soldiers were too addicted to opium to fight, and the economy was in ruins. The emperor appointed Lin Zexu, an incorruptible scholar official, to end the trade. Lin wrote a highly logical letter to Queen Victoria asking, "If opium is banned in your country because it's harmful, why do you allow it to harm ours?" When his plea was ignored, Lin acted. In March 1839, he blockaded the foreign merchant factories in Guangzhou. He demanded every chest of opium be surrendered. After a tense standoff, over 20,000 chests were handed over. Lin destroyed it all at Humen Beach and flushing it into the sea. On 3 November 1839, the British merchant ship Royal Saxon defied a naval blockade to trade at Guangzhou. British Superintendent Charles Elliot ordered his own warship to fire warning shots to stop the vessel. Observing from nearby, the Chinese admiral stationed in Guangzhou believed the British were attacking a peaceful merchant ship and moved his fleet forward to protect it. The British interpreted this defensive move as an act of aggression and opened fire on the Chinese fleet. This misunderstanding triggered the first major naval clash of the conflict. The incident provided the spark that escalated the trade standoff into the First Opium War. The British framed it as a defense of free trade and British honor. British steam-powered iron-hulled warship like the Nemesis decimated the Chinese wooden junks. British artillery could fire from distance the Chinese couldn't even see. After the British sailed up the Yangtze and threatened the city of Nanjing, the Qing government was forced to sign the first unequal treaty. The war ended in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanjing, a document that fundamentally stripped China of its economic and legal autonomy. Under its terms, China was forced to pay 21 million silver dollars in reparations, a sum that included $6 million to compensate the British for opium Lin Zexu has destroyed, forcing the victims to pay for the drugs that had destabilized their society. The treaty also compelled China to open 5 major ports to unrestricted British trade. This loss of control extended to the courtroom through extraterritoriality, which granted British subjects immunity from Chinese law. Any crime committed by Britain on Chinese soil could only be tried in the British court, marking a significant surrender of national sovereignty. Furthermore, China lost the power to regulate its own economy as Britain gained the right to help dictate fixed trade tariffs, ensuring the British imports, including opium, would always maintain a competitive advantage. Perhaps the most lasting blow was the cession of Hong Kong Island to Britain in perpetuity, establishing a colonial foothold that would remain outside the Chinese control for the next 155 years. Seeking full legalization of opium, the British used the 1856 Arrow Incident, the arrest of the Chinese crew on the ship with expired British registration, as a pretext for the Second Opium War. France joined in, seeking for its own concessions. By 1858, the Qing were forced into the Treaty of Tianjin, opening more ports and allowing foreign legations in Beijing. When the emperor refused to ratify the treaty, Allied forces marched on the capital in 1860. In an act of barbarism dressed as civilization, Lord Elgin ordered the destruction of the Old Summer Palace. For 3 days, troops looted and burned the 1806-acre masterpiece. The smoke, visible for miles, was a calculated move to break the Chinese spirit. This forced the signing of the Convention of Beijing, which finally made opium fully legal and ceded coloring to the British. This Century of Humiliation reached its peak in 1900 when the eight-nation alliance, including Britain, Russia, Japan, France, Germany, United States, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, descended like vultures to crush the Boxer Rebellion and carve out sphere of influence. The Qing Dynasty, broke and discredited, finally collapsed in 1912. To understand Beijing's choices today, we have to stop treating them as isolated reactions to current events. China's policies do not emerge for short-term improvisation. They are the result of long historical correction, a systematic effort to ensure that the conditions of the 19th century can never be repeated. The period known in China as the Century of Humiliation was not just a sequence of military defeats, it was a complete collapse of sovereignty. Foreign powers dictated trade terms, occupied ports, imposed legal immunity for their citizens, and physically carved China into competing spheres of influence. The lesson China internalized was brutal. Sovereignty without power is meaningless. This historical trauma explains why non-intervention has become one of the most rigid principles of Chinese foreign policy. In international forums, Beijing consistently defends the absolute right of the state to manage its internal affairs without outside pressure. To Western audiences, this is often framed as a shield of repression. To Beijing, it is a defensive doctrine, a direct response to the past in which intervention was the mechanism through which China was dismantled. When Western governments criticize China's internal policies, Beijing does not interpret this as neutral moral concern. It hears echoes of earlier demands of concessions, inspections, and compliance. This is why China does not adopt the idea of universal values imposed from the outside and instead champions a strict Westphalian interpretation of sovereignty. In this worldview, internal governance is off limits to foreign judgment, not as a philosophical preference, but as a survival rule. This same logic governs China's approach to territorial integrity. Regions such as Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and the South China Sea are not viewed as isolated policy challenges. They are seen through a single historical lens. Fragmentation invites intervention. From Beijing's perspective, every precedent of separatism weakens the state and recreates the vulnerabilities that foreign powers once exploited. Where the West sees the erosion of democracy in Hong Kong, Beijing sees the closure of a colonial-era fault line. Where the West sees tension over Taiwan, Beijing sees an unresolved civil war that foreign power could weaponize. Unity in this framework is not ideological nationalism, it is a defensive necessity. The Opium Wars also taught China another lesson that continues to shape its behavior today. Wealth without technology parity is a liability. In the 19th century, China was economically rich but technologically inferior, and that imbalance proved fatal. Modern Chinese policy is driven by the need to avoid a repeat of that mistake. This is the real driver behind initiatives like Made in China 2025, massive investment in semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and advanced manufacturing. Beijing does not view current trade restrictions and technology bans as normal economic competition. It interprets them as modern equivalent of naval blockades, attempt to cap China's development from the outside. Technological self-reliance, therefore, is not growth strategy alone. It is a form of strategic insulation. China's governance model follows the same historical logic. After decades of internal chaos, civil war, and foreign exploitation, stability became synonymous with survival. The Chinese leadership does not see liberal democracy as a neutral system, but as one that, in their historical context, risks fragmentation and paralysis. Centralized authority, long-term planning, and social control are justified internally as safeguards against disorder, not as ends in themselves. On the global stage, China has deliberately reframed its identity. No longer positioning itself as a victim, it presents itself as an alternative pole of power, especially for developing nations. Initiatives like the Belt and Road are not just economic projects, they are part of a broader effort to build trade networks and political relationships that bypass Western-dominated systems. Beijing offers infrastructure and financing without the political conditions that often accompany Western aid, framing itself as a partner rather than a tutor. China selectively adopts Western technology and economic practices, but does not adopt Western political models. Modernization, in Beijing's view, does not require ideological convergence. It requires strength, cohesion, and control over strategic dependencies. Seen through this lens, China's actions form a coherent pattern. Every policy that reinforces internal stability, every naval expansion, and every push of indigenous technology is a brick in a defensive structure designed to prevent a return to historical vulnerability. China's actions in 2026 are often described as aggressive, paranoid, and authoritarian. But that interpretation misses the core logic entirely. What we are seeing is not expansion for its own sake, it is insulation. Not chaos, but overcorrection. Not improvisation, but doctrine. The Opium Wars taught China a brutal lesson. Sovereignty without power is an illusion. Wealth without technology is a liability. Division invites intervention. Every major policy choice Beijing makes today traces back to that realization. Its commitment to territorial integrity is not nationalism, it is trauma management. Its resistance to foreign interference is not ideological arrogance, it is historical memory. Its push to technological self-reliance is not competition, it is a survival strategy. This doesn't mean these policies are morally right, economically optimal, or globally beneficial. It means they are internally consistent. Western analysis often fails because it assumes China is trying to join an existing system. It isn't. China is trying to make sure that no external power ever again has the leverage to dictate its future, economically, militarily, or politically. You don't have to agree with this worldview. But if you want to understand China, if you want to predict its behavior rather than simply react to it, this is where you have to start. Because Beijing isn't asking for permission, it's settling historical accounts.